If you're a movie collector, you need Movies Anywhere. It pulls your favorite purchase movies from participating digital retailers into one central place, so you can finally say goodbye to scattered movie collections and hello to an organized library. With Movies Anywhere, you can watch your favorite movies on any compatible device, whenever and wherever you want. Ready to grow and enjoy your digital collection? Visit moviesanywhere.com/welcome and register for free. Registration with Movies Anywhere required. Open to U.S. residents 13 and over. It used to be hard to find the exact auto parts you needed, and that meant spending a lot of time at swap meets. It's a different game now when you can order exactly what you need from eBay Motors. They have 122 million parts, so you can always find the right fitment. Spend less time searching and more time building with the eBay Motors app, or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
Hey everyone, this is the Almost World Podcast. Bringing to you mind-blowing interviews with guests from all over the world. So settle down, relax, and enjoy the show. Oh yeah, by the way, if you like the podcast, please support Elmo's World Podcast on Patreon. Your support is what helps the podcast improve more and more. Welcome to Elmo's World Podcast, and I have an awesome guest here, and someone with a worldview that is very unique, and there's someone that I've never had on the show before, but I'm really glad that he's here. And his name is Dave Klier. Hey man, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. How's it going, guys? My name's Dave. I am a philosophy student and grad student at large, meaning that I just kind of pick classes from kind of anywhere. I got into philosophy by chance when I had to take a class in philosophy for my basic general classes. As Emma was talking about, I do have kind of a different outlook on a lot of different things, and I generally consider myself to be like a Norse Buddhist. So I take things from, like the Norse gods like Thor and Odin. Everybody knows about those guys. And I also take aspects from Buddhism. So that's kind of like, if we're talking theism, that's kind of where my view comes from, but I do see them very differently, and it's how they kind of interlink together, because most people wouldn't expect those to fit together. That's kind of interesting.
And when you say Norse Buddhism, it goes me back. It gets me, to this episode I watched on the show Vikings on Netflix.
Oh yeah.
And so there's this the son of Ragnar. What was his name? And he was into like drugs and everything, but then he sort of found peace in his life with this Buddhism.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He sort of went through this phase of having Buddhist ideals.
Yeah.
And
That
being
one
a
was,
Viking though.
Yeah, that one was
Vitser.
That was his name.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what are your thoughts on it? Like, how the hell did you become a Norse Buddhist, man?
Originally, I grew up as a Christo-pagan. I don't know if that's a word that really most people would be aware of. My folks they took aspects of different ancient cultures and introduced them into Christianity. Basically, the idea was that all gods exist, we just choose this God. From there, my folks were always very open and just test everything out. For a little while I was just Buddhist, for a little while I was Wiccan, and then it just kind of eventually I played a little while as an atheist, and all of these things kind of ended up bringing about my metaphysical view of that. And so for me, it was like I ended up just choosing these gods because they were the ones that most aligned with what I had for goals.
So there's a lot there, and I want to go back to the parenting first. Okay, so I believe, right, and I believe you would agree with me that your parents had huge influence to who you are now, and especially on what you believe in terms of Norse Buddhism. right?
Mhm.
Can you dive into your parents' worldview first and give us a little background, because
Yeah.
that is necessary, right, to
Yeah,
understanding.
sure. So my folks were more geared at the interpretive view of the Bible, if that makes sense, where nothing is literal, if anything. So they didn't even really read the Bible a whole lot. It was based on the idea that God is for them anyways, was just like an ethereal thing. It was it was God itself was nature, sort of a lot like Spinoza talks about. um, Everything around us is God. God is in all things. So for my folks, that was they kind of just followed Spinoza's footsteps. Obviously they didn't know who Spinoza was, but they went with that route and said that God was nature, and so they revered nature in the same way that they revered God.
But there was a concept that you threw out there, which was that your parents, believed that there were all pagans gods sort of
Mm-hmm.
existed, but you only
Mm-hmm.
chose this one. What does that mean?
Yeah, yeah. So my folks, they looked at, like I mentioned, the ethereal God, meaning like it wasn't any specific God. It was just what they called, basically you could just replace God with nature for them, right?
Mhm.
And my ideas after I started going into philosophy a little bit more changed and kind of shifted away from what my folks were thinking. Like my metaphysics ended up coming down to a phenomenology of experience, definitely coming from like Kant, and in his difference in his epistemology between having the phenomenal world and the nominal world, in that we can only really know our own mind, like we can only know our perception. We basically have rose-colored glasses on. So for this, like, I know it sounds really bad, but it sounds crazy to most people, I should say. But like, as an example, I believe that Santa exists. I know that sounds really crazy, and a lot of atheists like to throw it out there to say that, oh, okay, well, we'll just replace the word God with Santa and see how things work. It's all the same. But they're actually kind of proving the point of what I'm trying to get at, is that Santa exists in our mind, and the mind is the only thing that we can know it actually exists. So if they're in our mind somewhere, then they have to be there somewhere. So that makes it easy for you to kind of just pick and choose whatever gods you actually want, just because they all exist in the mind.
So I want to understand where you're coming from here,
Mm-hmm.
and so let's talk about metaphysics. Okay.
Sure.
Metaphysics, right? By definition, the ultimate reality in what it is.
Right.
Yeah. So
It's a way to put it. Yeah.
yeah. So what do you think about metaphysics? Where should we start, and then sort of finding
Sure.
answers to the truth?
Sure. So the way I kind of define it is a little bit more in the academic sense. I mean, your definition is pretty much the same thing, but the way I view metaphysics is the study of what things are.
Mm-hmm.
So like, what is this thing? And I'm what would be like a dualist is generally what people would call me. Is I think that there is things out in the universe somewhere, but there's also immaterial things, like mind is a classic example. Descartes actually came up with, most people know him for "I think, therefore I am," or "I think and thinking things exist, so I must exist." But one of his best arguments, I think, is actually the argument where he basically says you wake up in the morning and you go to the bathroom to open up the door. You flick on the lights as you're looking in the mirror, and then all of a sudden you don't see any body. Like you're just a floating. You're basically like a ghost, right? But you don't see anything. But then he says that's possible to actually envision. And then he says, but now let's go the opposite direction. You wake up in the morning, you go to the bathroom, you flick on the lights, and lo and behold, there's no mind. He says that you can't imagine not having a mind, partly because you have to have a mind to imagine being in that mind. But you can imagine not having a body. So that's his way to kind of say that there's two different things, that they're two separate entities. They're not the same thing. And that's kind of what I piggyback off of for my dualism.
By the way, by how you define mind, mind is not the consciousness, or is it?
I mean, for me, yeah, that has a big part of what mind is. I mean, there are like subconscious things, so I don't want to sit here and say that mind purely is consciousness, but I would say all aspects that culminate into a personality, if that makes sense.
So metaphysics, right? And so you sort of you are in fact a dual substance dualist in this
Correct. Yep.
so in the sense that there is a material world and there's an immaterial world, which
Exactly.
is where the realm of the mind, it's that's the medium for the mind. And so there's a lot of questions to unpack there, but I wanna ask then. So what we humans, right? We are individual creatures. We in our brains. That's where our consciousness actually lies in. But do you sort of hold like, is God this universal consciousness, like the universal mind, or then we're all just part of this one big mind, or is it different? What are your thoughts on that?
I get you. Yeah. So there's a lot of people that think that way. I know a few people that I've talked to in the past have had that view where there's a collective consciousness, and that collective consciousness is God. For me, it actually comes to, this is where my Buddhist side will come in a little bit, in that I don't particularly think that we exist. I know that sounds crazy because I just spoke about dualism and the mind having this being the existence. But the
Interesting.
but the idea is that we're always in this constant state of flux, including our personalities. So from one moment to the next, I'm not the same person. I may be building on the person that I was, but I'm no longer that person, even after I'm done with this interview.
But what do you mean by we don't exist, though? Because
Hmm.
we are in fact in a constant state of flux, right? And
Hmm.
but at the single point, there is something you have to call that is you,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
In
Right,
turn,
right,
and that is what we call, in by definition, that what is essentially you. And
right.
and of course, there by our definition of identity and our and personality, there is that, like a constant chain of essence sort of riding
Hmm.
along in that constant chain of flux. And even though it's constantly changing, the essence is still there. But
Hmm.
how do you look at it?
I actually, in there was a course called Death by Yale, and uh, I think one of his thought experiments, it summed it up really well. And the way that he put it was basically, I want you to imagine like a train, and you're looking at this train in front of you. You can see the engine, and you can see the caboose. You can see the whole thing. That's, for me at least, that is what you are. And the caboose is when you were born, and the engine is when you die, essentially. Like, let's just put it that way. That's the course of your life.
Mm.
However, let's put like, maybe there's a place that's filling these the cars for the train, and they're filling it up, but that obscures our view. Can we say that there's like like it's blocking our view right in the middle of the train? We see the caboose and we see the engine, but we don't see the middle. We can't say that that train is necessarily linked. And for me, it's the passage of time that does that. That obscures, that we can't go back in time. We can't go forward. And but the only way we can only go forward in time at the constant rate of time, right? So for me, it's kind of like, I can't guarantee that the person I was yesterday, say, is the person I am now, because we have this passage of time. So I have a pretty
Yeah.
strong skeptical bone in my body for that. So that's kind of how I see like the personhood, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean you don't exist.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So how can you say, if you are trying to make sense of everything here without contradicting yourself, saying
Hmm.
that there is a you and then you don't exist? How does that work?
Right. I know it's really a really tough concept, but the way that it works is like again, you have to imagine that train, and like, we're always in this even just the last minute when we started this conversation. I can't tell you that I am the person that told you
Oh, I see. So
anything.
how you define you is that in the person with the whole lifetime of
Exactly.
experiences.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
because that's not, because I can't go back to that experience, since I can't travel back to it. All I have is that
Mm,
memory of it. I can't
mm,
say that that was me. So I'm always in that constant state of flux, like I mentioned. So I
mm,
can't, like, even just the last moment, the time marches on no matter what. Even in the last millisecond, time changes so fast that
mm.
way that I can't guarantee that my last memory that I ever had, even in my phenomenal world where I'm experiencing
Yeah.
the computer screen in front of me. So my idea of personal identity is that we exist. I mean, yeah, there's a train there, but we can't, it's obscured. So I can't tell you
Yeah.
that for sure. There's, you know,
But in terms of like a you know, like a what do you call this? An immaterial existence. There is an existence there for
yeah, yeah,
yeah. Okay.
yeah. I call it like an enduring self.
Enduring self. Okay. So in terms of this, this has a lot of entailments in terms of ethics and even politics, society. But I want to continue this route that we went through with in terms of metaphysics. So origins. Okay, so you're probably a naturalist then, or because but you are a substance dualist. So
So are we speaking specifically about my dualism here, or are we
origins, like the universe and existence and everything.
Oh, sure, sure. So me, I actually like to follow a little bit in Piro's footsteps. Piro was a really strong skeptic, one that it was sad. It's only a story, but apparently his students had to stop him from jumping off a cliff because he wasn't convinced that he would die if he jumped off. But his view, basically his general underlying standard that carries on to today, is that there are equally valid or cogent arguments for both sides of the argument, right? So the way I see it is that he wants to say that because that is true, because we can't tell which one is actually truth, even if they're completely contradictory, then we are to abstain from making a decision between those 2 points. And he thought that led to like a state of peace called ataraxia. But I actually want to carry it further and go with Aristotle, who said in his Golden Mean, basically saying that somewhere in between there is actual truth, or at least you'll get closer to truth if you go somewhere in the middle. So for me, where the universe comes about coming from that, it's really looked at as like, I can't, like I was mentioning about personal identity, I can't go back in time. So for me, experience is one of the big epistemological views of mine. I have to have that experience to validate it, right? So I can't go into the past to see when or how the universe came about. All we can do is reason about it. And due to that, there's been some good arguments about, whether an omnipotent deity created the universe or not. And usually what I try to say with that is I say, well, that's a possibility. I could say God or an omnipotent being or the Jotun, the giants set in motion what happened. But then that also entails its own contradiction where, people will end up doing that. Well, who created created them to create the universe? So for me, it's a very hard point for me to try to work through, but I come to the conclusion at the end of the day that somebody or something caused and put into motion the Big Bang. And for me, that's as far as I'm willing to go. I'm not willing to say it was a god or a set of gods, but I am willing to say that something happened to set it in motion. And that's where I have to leave it, I guess.
But there is an option to say like there is an uncaused cause, right? Is that
Right.
what you're referring to?
Not necessarily. I'm kind of more open-minded with it, if that makes sense. Again, because all we have is arguments for it. We don't have because again,
So you're still agnostic on it then?
Yeah. I stay pretty relatively agnostic on the origins of the universe. So
okay, but when it comes to the origins of the universe, and your stance on it, right? You yourself already have a stance on dualism, right? And so it doesn't go, like too far to us to say that you also you can also have your stance on the origins of the universe itself, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the difference is that I can experience mine. I can't experience the beginning of the Big Bang. So that's where I kind of, for my epistemology being experience based.
Okay, it's epistemology. So this is what's stopping you from making a philosophical conclusion for yourself about the origins of the universe, which is, it's not as strong as because you have a strong epistemological, I guess, experience
For
of
having
your
experience.
existence and your personality and identity. So that's why you have a more stable, I guess, conclusion to that. So
Yep.
so how does your epistemology work? I guess I mean like method. What's your
Yeah,
method?
sure. So I am very big into logic when it comes to my classes. Anytime I can find a logic class to take, other than like symbolic logic, I do not like symbolic logic, but like practical reasoning, critical thinking, stuff like that, classes like that, I really enjoy. Partly because I am kind of like a mix between both an empiricist and a rationalist. The way I see it is that neither can work without each other,
Are you
essentially. Um,
evidentialist?
Evidentialist. No, I don't think I would call myself necessarily
Okay.
evidentialist.
Okay.
So for me, it's more like I'm looking at um, when you're using a rationalist is creating arguments, and they think that truth can be found in pure reason, in reason alone. But those reasons come from either an inductive realization about the world or an experience in some way, and that's where I'm coming from. Like Descartes, the classic again is I think. Well, he experienced that he thought, so that's how that premise came about.
So you're saying that Descartes, the ultimate rationalist, his whole creator ergo sum is contingent on an empirical conclusion.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's break it down. So when you say like a phenomenon, you're sort of saying this qualia, right?
Yeah.
So how? Okay, so there is this abstraction, that our minds is capable of, and we sort of categorize things into groups, and one group is our personality, is identity. But of course, as you said, there is actually no us, right? And there's just these collective emotions and every like nerves that are just
Well,
electrical
I
stuff.
wouldn't say that. I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't say that there's not a self in that way. There's not like the enduring, like I can't say right now that I am me, because I literally just said that, and I can't guarantee that the me that said that is the me that's me now. That's all. It's that enduring, like as far as like the me that has that electrical impulses. I'm not so worried about that. I'm worried about that persistence over time, not so much.
So not so much into the ontology, but
Yeah.
more so into the chronological continuation of that specific
Yes. Yes.
the identification of you. So
Yeah. Yeah.
there's a lot of
Difficult
philosophical
topic.
terms that I'm using. Okay.
It's a difficult topic. I get
Means
it,
is
but
a really good episode. Yeah. Okay. And
good.
interesting. Okay. So how then, can using your epistemology, how then can one arrive at the truth, right? Because of if there, this you that you can't guarantee, when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to relation to time doesn't exist,
Mm-hmm.
but of course it
Mm-hmm.
does ontologically exist. Like, how
Right.
can
Right.
you arrive at truth
Yeah.
when your own logical conclusions rely on this
Mm-hmm.
on events and phenomenon that I have to rely on, like, and more so empiricism as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually really glad that you asked this question. I'm actually just finishing a paper that's it's titled "Drawing Conclusions About Truth from Aristotle, Pyrrho, and Hegel."
Oh,
I'm using a term that I don't know if it's ever been used before, but it's what I'm calling it is consideratism. So
consideratism.
the idea of consideratism is just like you said. How are we supposed to know? Well, it's a conclusion drawn by Pyrrho, who again said that there's equally valid and strong arguments for both sides of any issue. And Aristotle says that truth lies between those two extremes. And Hegel says that we arrived at it now because there was two different extremes that worked to like had that conversation in the dialectic that ended up creating that synthesis of what we have now. So what my idea of truth is that there's not really a way for us. I actually, in the paper, I talk about using truth to actually mean, if we define it this way, as our best current understanding, not necessarily a pure objective truth, because I also follow from Kant with those rose-colored glasses, and that we are the nominal world, the world that it actually is obscured by our perception of it. That's all we have. So consideratism, what it does is it looks at all of the different arguments that are valid and strong or cogent, and what we do is we use them and consider, like, we remove how we actually currently feel or think about about that issue, and we take that other view then into account, this new view that comes about, and we incorporate it into our already existing view. So like the classic example is, as we've talked about within materialism, idealism, and dualism. Well, dualism is that midway point, or that like understanding between idealism and materialism. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to have pure objective truth, but I do think it makes it so that we're a little bit closer, even if we're never really going to hit the mark. It's not sticking on one side of the ends of the spectrum, but it's including both of them to find somewhere in between there to have little pieces of each side of the issue.
Yeah. So in this sense, like consideratism is more into just sort of settling for for the synthesis that
yes, settle for the synthesis, exactly. I couldn't put it better myself.
And that took a lot of brain power, but yes, okay. But I know for the audience there that's not into that they're not familiar with the philosophical terms. Let's sort of separate first. Like break it down for them. And so when the basic terms here that one of this is phenomenal and nominal. Can you sort of explain it? What the difference?
So this came from the phenomenal and the nominal worlds are something that Kant brought up. His idea was that we are in a position where we experience things, right? So I see things, I can touch things, I have these senses, right? He says the question then is what I'm seeing actually the thing that it is? Well, what he realizes is that I can't leave my body and experience it directly. I have to do it through my senses. That's all that I can do it with. So for him, the nominal world is this thing where it's the world as it actually is.
Yeah.
The pure objective world that nothing can touch, basically. The phenomenal world is the world that we experience the nominal world through. It gets filtered through all of our senses. So the nominal world has an effect on the phenomenal world, the world that we experience, but that's that filter that happens.
Well, there's sort of like I wouldn't call it like it is sort of an inception happening here, in terms of like for example, our mind has a sort of a direct link to the nominal world because and it is sort of would you say that the mind, as because there's a dualism here, would you say that the mind is a part of the nominal world, or is it like separate, or is it?
That's a good question.
What is it?
That's a good question. I would say that because I do think that there was a great argument that I saw once that said that like the soul, as an example, is something that generates the brain power to make the personality. Essentially, like there's an underlying mechanism to life, right? That was kind of their main argument. And while that was not entirely convincing to me, what I will say is that it did have some good points to point out that with us being a person, we have to generate a mind from some method. Obviously, if we get brain damage or something like that, our minds, like our perception of the world changes, or something along those lines. So for me, it's like, I think that there's some sort of means to generate the generator, if that makes sense. Brain is the generator, but then there's the gasoline, that has to keep the generator running. And while a lot of people also, just talk about food and stuff like that, if you don't feed your mind as well, then same kind of concept. So that's kind of the way I see it, is that there's a generator that does it, but then there's a fuel to that generator.
So in this sense, though, I think that how you differentiate phenomenal from nominal is different from the immaterial to the material. They sort of overlap each other, and it's not the same thing, right?
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah. So the mind is actually sort of both a phenomenal thing and a nominal, and sort of nominal also, some parts
Exactly.
of it.
You can think of it this way, is that, when we say justice is a perfect example of this. If we we have the idea of justice, and we justice then isn't a real thing, right? But then if we serve justice is a real thing, and in action, it's in that motion, right? And as much as I'm not really one of those types to say that a personhood, so I don't want this to get misconstrued, I'm not the type to say that personhood is is all about a state of motion. What I do want to point out is that with justice, you can see it in there, definitely, where justice can be served, and then you have justice. But justice is also a concept, so it's almost like there's two versions of justice, if that makes sense. But they interlink with each other.
Yeah, but justice as a whole has the both substances, the material and in the material,
Exactly,
embedded into its essence. So let's sort of recap here, right? That we've sort of covered a lot of complicated stuff. Okay. Your metaphysics is that your in terms of your personality, you don't really believe that there's a you in the sense that of a chronological timelines kind of sense, that enduring stuff, right?
Right. It's kind of, I just don't want, I mean, I can't guarantee there was.
Yeah, you can't guarantee. Yeah, and that's the right term. But there is an ontological you, and also, but the you is more or less the mind, right?
Yeah.
But the mind also involves the unconscious, also, and of course the sort of the both the body and the immaterial you. Right. So you can't really separate a mind from the body, right? It's all. Can you though? In your definition?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the way I see it is that when we, this is going to get into my speculative view of what happens after death, right? So a lot of times we'll point that out, because they'll recognize that, and they'll say something along the lines, well, then how can you be a person of faith if your mind has to be generated by the brain? And while I say that is true, I also don't think that I think, if I was to point out Wittgenstein and say, if we just had an understanding of what our definitions were, then we would be able to not argue. And for me, when it comes to this, is I'm seeing the brain as a word that we use attached to, what that organ is. And for me, while that's still technically true, I don't think the brain actually goes away. After we die, after we decompose, after everything, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, all of that, our brain isn't gone. It just transformed into something else. So that's where that ends up going with because a lot of times people do point that out.
Yeah, like when you die, the atoms in your brain is still the same thing, like when you were alive.
Right.
So, but it's just, there's that change but okay. Other than that, so let's move into sort of the ethics here, the metaethics, and So what is good, what is evil?
Hi, it's John Taffer from Bar Rescue. Did you know the second building in America was a tavern? When I built my new restaurant franchise concept, Taffer's Tavern, I thought back to the roots of what makes a tavern, timeless character, all while delivering an unbelievably delicious food and beverage experience. That, paired with my 40 plus years in the industry, provides a clear roadmap to success. Do you have what it takes to be a Taffer's Tavern franchisee? If so, I'd love to hear from you. Visit franchise.tafferstavern.com.
Gearheads know that some projects need so many parts, it feels like you need a whole storage unit just to store them. That's what eBay Motors' 122 million parts are for. Think of it as your virtual parts garage. They've always got the right fitment at the right prices. Use the eBay Motors app or visit ebaymotors.com. Let's ride.
So in your framework.
Yeah. So ethics is actually one of my favorite fields, primarily because I've had instances in my life where I'm always trying to figure out currently, even though that it's only a memory, whether I did the right thing or not. Without getting too much into it, I had like a passing in the family that maybe I could have changed, or maybe I could have had some sort of effect on. And I think a lot of people that go through a death in the family end up having this kind of thought. So I don't find myself too out of character with it. But without digressing too much, is that my ethics is something that comes back to that consideratism, where we have to consider all of these factors. They all have really good arguments. I really like the classic, like Jeremy Bentham, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That utilitarianism, I think, is very valuable, but I think that different ethical theories have to be placed in different instances. So I don't think that you should just stick to one ethical theory all the time. I think that different ethical theories have a better play in certain instances. Like when we're talking about like Kant again, and he was talking about his ethics with the ontology, applying a general rule universally, he had the rebuttal of, well, what if, you're hiding a friend and a murderer comes over and says, are you hiding your friend? And Kant kind of doubled down, and he said that you have to tell the person yes, because you wouldn't be respecting their autonomy anymore. And so like there's instances where I just don't think that's very convincing. But then also same thing with utilitarianism, where it's like, yeah, I mean, the greatest number or the greatest happiness for the greatest number sounds great until we start talking about being on a lifeboat with 5 other people and deciding if we should cannibalize one of them to survive. And so it's like, there's different instances for different ethical theories, and I can't quite tell you what it is that causes me as an example to determine what ethical theory to use in what certain situations. But I do have a sense, and it's something that I'd like to explore more, is that this ethical theory is better for here, and this ethical theory is better for here.
Yeah, but I find that very problematic, really. Like, because like the purpose of developing an ethical theory is, at least you have something both coherent and consistent to share to the world, and we would sort of unite and apply it. And then that, and so that I guess uniformity and in our decision making and measurement of what is good and evil, right? Because if there is that there are many useful and ethical theories that are, some will be more effective in this situation, and another will be more effective in another situation, as you said. But in terms of like which one will we use and who actually determines which one is better for this, then that's a sort of a very subjective. And I don't want to go into like the objective versus subjective, but in terms of I guess there's just mainly pragmatic purposes. It's a more uniform ethical and metaethics. I guess ethical framework is actually, I guess for me, would be a lot better than just let's use this for this and that for that, because then anyone can, if anyone can do that, then what's the point of actually, you know, determining what is right or wrong, right? Like for example, let's say Hitler, right? Like how can I as an individual say that Hitler was wrong? But maybe because like if you know, for Hitler, you know, he thought that, you know, exterminating the Jews was much better because he was using this ethical framework compared to others. So it was his decision, and you know, and so from my framework that you know. I'm using the same thing he is because I recognize that there are others, you know, it depends really. So what do you think about this? Like,
Yeah, definitely.
yeah.
So I've heard that one a few times, and my problem isn't necessarily that it because you're right. There are some inconsistencies there, but when we think of what ethics is and where it kind of stems from, it stems from a subfield called value theory. Value theory holds two different prominent subfields of philosophy. One is ethics, and the other is aesthetics. And so when we really look at where it came from, and it's from value, right? So when I'm kind of generalizing here, but I think that when we talk about values, a lot of people have different views of value, and it tends to be a little bit subjective when it comes to values as a whole. But without getting, again, too much into whether it's subjective, and I don't really think it's subjective, first of all, but that's just where it's stemming from, is that there's going to be almost as many different views as there are people. But we could look at this in the lens of what I've been writing on is consideratism, in that, like, you know, you look at these different things, and like that's basically it's my consideratist argument for why we would choose these different views for whenever we need to, because really trying to put those all together, trying to put them all together into one consideratist view would be incredibly difficult. And it's still something I'm working on. I'm willing to admit that, but it's something that I think that can eventually happen. But the idea is essentially that we have to figure out what that underlying cause is to decide when one theory is better than another. I don't know what it is yet. I'm not there, but I do have this sense that there is something underneath that's going to determine what theory one should be using, which would then make it more objective, so that you would know. Basically, I see all ethical theories as a tool to get closer to what you should do, not necessarily that it determines goodness or evil, just that it's that tool, kind of like you know, Bentham again said that,
just a tool. Okay.
that he could have Bentham thought that he could make, you know, a kind of calculus to determine happiness of people. And so I see it kind of in that way with all of the different theories, is that they're kind of a catalyst.
I see. Interesting. Yeah. Well, if you put it that way, okay, you know, no problem with me actually. Okay, so it's just a tool, and you know, but in this sense, of course, like a tool, but you know, like you know, a knife in the hands of a chef, it's useful, but in the hands of an evil person, you know, I guess like it's going to, it can be used in a bad way as well. But of course, well, I guess I want to go back to the consideratism because this is really interesting. Like you applied it to metaphysics, and you were able to apply it to metaethics. So consideratism is actually more of a like a process, right?
Yes. Yep.
And
I actually, in my paper, I talk about how you know, there's normally a there's a really big contradiction, as somebody would point out, in consideratism, and that is that if you have to not care what your view is currently and accept what another view is, then you would no longer be a consideratist if their argument is against consideratism. And my response to that is that, yeah, that would be true if consideratism was a viewpoint to actually have, and every consideratist had the same view. But it's not exactly. It's more of a tool and a process of determining what could possibly be closest to truth, rather than accept it itself as true.
This is a lot of this is a it's 7 a.m. in the morning, and I did not expect this, but it is awesome, man. Thank you. Okay, okay. So that was a bit of into the philosophical side, but in terms of the Norse Buddhism, that's something I cannot let let pass. So how did you become decide to be that? Because obviously your parents had a much different, I guess, belief, like the Christo pagan. And so what is a Norse Buddhist? What do you believe? Everything. Can you tell us about it?
Sure, yeah. So when it comes to my Norse Buddhism, I look at a few different factors that kind of set up a bunch of different things. I'm actually pulling something out real quick here because I actually have a few notes on it that I wanted to bring up. But essentially, I got into it because they were the gods that I seen that had what would be working best for me. But I also see Buddhism as like a practice, if that makes sense. Not something that you necessarily are trying to use for an afterlife, but more so as something that will allow you to have more peace. There's generally, if anybody knows much about Buddhism, there's generally four noble truths, and they go like this. The first one would be all life contains some sort of suffering, and that suffering is caused by desires and attachment. So therefore, to end suffering, end desires and attachment. They call that nirvana. And then four, you end those desires and attachments by doing the Eightfold Path. But I kind of switch this around and I say, this is kind of like my four noble truths in a way, is that life is all about suffering. Okay, so I keep that, and that suffering is caused by desires and attachment. And then if you want to end suffering, end desires and attachment, but you can't end all desires and attachment. That's impossible. So there will always be some sort of suffering, no matter what, even if you want to end all of your desires and attachment.
Whoa.
we can lessen or maximize our relief of suffering, though, by following basically it's a condensed version of the Eightfold Path, which is basically just have the best intentions, do our best, and meditate. Now a lot of people will say, well, where do the Norse gods come in on this? And that is in suffering.
Yeah.
So the gods, essentially for me, they kind of weave our web of fate. So I am kind of a determinist in a way. I'm more of a soft determinist. They weave our fate, and they incorporate a lot of suffering as a means for us to learn, for us to overcome it, to give things satisfaction. So it's kind of like, they always talk about like the problem of evil for God. Well, this is kind of the problem of suffering. But this is how I've overcome it. Yeah. So my answer, like how a lot of people say that there's evil because of free will, they might say, or they'll say because it's a test. So there's evil for you to test to overcome it. Some people will say, and that's the one that I take for suffering, is that the gods do add this suffering to our lives for us to become better people so that we can overcome it.
I want you to use another term for gods here, because a lot of people might misunderstand what you mean by God, by like the Norse gods. Sure. Because they're probably like really imagining like real
like what I actually see.
Gods and the gods.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by like Norse gods, and they're being the suffering side of things?
Yeah, sure. So the way I see all gods is, again, this is going to sound crazy, but I see them a lot like Santa. They exist in our mind. That's undeniable. Just like how even like Pokemon, they exist. They're real. They're in our mind. So really, you can see like, as far as I'm aware, or as far as I'm concerned, I see myself as that being that does these things. And I essentially generate the gods, or the gods manifest themselves in me, so to speak. So when I think of them that way, that's where that suffering comes. Suffering comes from within, from the gods giving it to you, from the fate of your, basically you could say, biochemistry. That's what we'll say for the all intents and purposes, because otherwise it just gets too convoluted. But on a basic level, it's based on that. That's where the determinism comes from, but they exist in there. in that mind state, which causes suffering.
Okay. I guess if they're equivalent to Santa in terms of ontology, and so Santa has a description, right? Like he's this, fat guy that goes inside your roof, goes on your roof, and has reindeer and everything, and brings gifts. So, what are the gods in your Norse Buddhism?
Yeah, sure. So I think that any depiction that one makes of the gods, as long as they pulled it from their mind, is a valid description of the gods, because the gods are in their mind. So however they see the gods is however their gods are. So like my Christian God is not the same Christian God as yours. I mean, they are in a more ethereal sense, but our depiction, our phenomenal experience of them is all that we've got. So it draws back into philosophy, I guess, a bit, but it's that phenomenal way. So for me, the way I describe them and the way that I see them is I depict them as how they're just generally depicted. You might even see, I mean, I don't see any horns or anything like that, because that actually was not historically accurate. But so I see them, with the big beards, with all the stories and tales that have been told about them, from the Eddas, the Norse Eddas and the Havamal. Those are kind of like our versions of the Bible, even though I really don't want to call it that, because it acts very differently than the Bible. But how they're described in there is generally how I try to envision them, and the way that I envision them is not going to be the same as somebody else's. Just like how there's plenty of different depictions of what Jesus actually looked.
I wouldn't actually equate call this an equivalent to a religion. I feel like this is more of just a therapy in terms of how you're using it, like, because like if it's a therapy, it doesn't actually have to be like objective truth, like in terms of nominal or reality, because because if they, I guess to you, or by your definition, they are in fact real, that because they're in their minds, like Pokemon, Santa, they have this sort of ontology, but they're not real like us, in the same level of ontology. So I wouldn't say it's a religion, right? So in terms of, I would call it sort of like a therapy, because it allows you to reach this metaethical goal of like well-being and happiness that what you would want. So, and you find it very effective to have this Norse Buddhism, and apply it in your life. I would. Would you say that sort of? I'm putting it in a wrong way. What do you think?
So there's a lot of people, when they talk to Buddhists, they'll say that it's not a religion, and for them, they're like, well, for me, it's a religion. I don't know what else to tell you. That's how I'm feeling. I'm just not concerned with the afterlife. Like that's the way the Buddhist sees it, and that's where that comes from a little bit for me. But at the same time, when you're one thing that I found really interesting was that you had said that. So for me, the gods exist, but not like I exist, right? And I think that's kind of a misunderstanding with my view of personality and identity. So again, when I come back to identity, I don't even really necessarily exist, right? I exist in the same way that the gods exist. So we're on the level. Me and the gods are on the same playing field. We're in that same living world.
Whoa! Oh wait. Okay. So like you're you as the mind that is you.
Exactly.
Is just in terms of its ontology, is actually just is immaterial thing, right? And when you conceptualize, you think of these or imagine these gods in your mind, they're also then immaterial and in the same substance as the mind that is you. So we're made of the same thing.
Exactly. Yep.
I don't know what to say, but of course it's a lot to take in, but okay. All right, so application in your daily life. How do you live as a Norse Buddhist? What does it mean to be a Norse Buddhist, and the consequences and social, of course, stigma.
Yeah, definitely. I know that there is a lot of stigma. Even it's a tough fit for if you're a Norse Buddhist, because if you go to if you go to talk to a group of Norse people, then they're going to be like, well, we don't agree with you. And then if you go to a Buddhist camp, they're going to be like, what are you doing? Like, you're not Buddhist. So neither of them would consider me as part of the in group with them, if that makes sense. There is a small niche of us. We do exist. We're out there. Just not, we don't really have our own thing, because there's just not enough of us to really create an actual foundation of a group. But for me in my daily life, the way that this kind of culminates is really just like anytime you mentioned something about like it's a therapy in a way, and it is very much helpful in this, because I look at suffering in a different light. I look at suffering as something to overcome, something that is put there to better me, to make me a better person, to make me think harder, to be a better philosopher, to be a better, better family member, better everything, right? And if I overcome it, then it's a means for me to show that I'm progressing. And if I don't, then I learn that I still have things I need to work on. The goal for me is, like, as Piero said, for ataraxia, a state of peace, or, some other people have heard of eudaimonia, or rather like a state of just calm. And that's kind of what I think my goal is. I'm not saying that is the goal, but I do know it's what I want. And that's kind of why I see it that way. So for me, that pain and suffering is kind of central to it, but it's not as sad as it is in Buddhism. I think it's kind of sad in Buddhism, because in Buddhism, they're kind of like, there's nothing you can do about it besides kill all of your desires and attachments. And for me, I think that some desires and attachments are definitely good. And so, you still want to go after something knowing there's going to be suffering that you have to overcome. Like if I'm having a hard day at work and I'm pursuing it because I have a goal in mind with it, any suffering that comes with that, I know it's something it's something that's placed there specifically for me to overcome.
And that I believe, of course, that if it works for you, then I have to respect that. And of course, I believe differently.
Right.
Yeah?
And that's totally fine.
Yeah. But okay, so question though, we went to from your metaphysics, metaethics, and then I sort of ask you about your faith, which is Norse Buddhism. But you sort of introduce a lot of elements of Buddhism, like suffering, that and and it's impossible to eliminate desires and whatnot. But like, we have to ask first, like, is there a suffering from your from the starting point where you introduce your metaphysics and metaethics? Is there a thing as desire? And because if there's no you, then there is no suffering and there is no desire. So the path, the noble path that you introduce doesn't actually have any premise to hold on.
Yeah. So again, this is going to come back to that idea of it exists, but it doesn't, right? And I'm not trying to sound wishy-washy, but in that same way of how I exist, but I don't, there's the same thing with suffering. Just like I see suffering and I see desires a lot like I see justice. If we're sitting here talking about desires and talking about suffering, it's the ethereal desire, it's the ethereal suffering. But we experience specific indications of suffering. And just like how justice can get served, and then we can see justice existing, the same way that it doesn't really exist until it manifests. So suffering exists as it pops up.
So in a way, like, so what happens here is I'm seeing something like a meta. This is a meta observation.
Yeah.
Okay, so okay, yeah, I get your point, right? Like same as Santa, same as the gods, right? The desire, suffering, they're in this same substance as the mind that is us, right? From your perspective,
Yep.
Okay, but. So what I notice here is that in terms of intentionality, you are familiar,
Yep,
I guess,
yep.
So intentionality is that in our universe, right, our consciousness is able to sort of go to a certain direction, right, and actually and arrange the universe in the and our and the atoms and everything into the specific path that we want,
Right.
and there and in terms of intention. And so what I'm noticing here is that there is something that exists in this universe, which is a nominal thing, and then it's sort of an agent that causes these immaterial things to exist however it wants. It's like a child playing with Roblox and creating anything out of this world, anything that into the limits of its imagination, so what it's creating, the Roblox things that it's playing with, it could be any religion, it could be any faith or any belief system or any crazy stuff that could exist. So like a Jedi, like a Star Wars, Narnia, anything that could actually exist. So is that possible then from your framework?
So it comes back to that Kant, right? Where we're talking about that phenomenal world, right? I'm not here to sell you that is what is the case, right? What I can tell you is that my mind is the only thing that's here that I know of for absolute certain, and I know that those things exist in that mind. So I think you made a really good analogy when you were talking about like the Roblox and stuff like that. I was thinking like Legos, right? So
Legos. Legos.
If a kid is playing with Legos, they can make whatever they want, and it is that thing, right? It's kind of in the same kind of vein there. Like a lot of times people will ask me, well, so I'll hear from the Norse crowd, they'll be like, so you believe that the Christian God exists? I'm like, yeah, I mean, I have an idea of him in my mind, and my mind is a real thing. So the Christian God exists. I just prefer to choose the ones that work best for me.
But this isn't sort of like a solipsism thing, right? Like it's different.
Yeah, it's slightly different. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm full on solipsist, but I definitely do have a skeptical bone in my body where I'm like, I'm not willing, because obviously on a practical level, this is obviously generalizing, but I think that solipsism really is only great in theory, like as an idea, but it's not like, I don't think any solipsist really is truly a solipsist, if that makes sense. I think that they're just more looking at it as this possible idea that could be possible, but they're not really acting like it's true. So for me, like, I'm accepting that they don't
there might be that one true solipsist out there.
They're out there. They exist, but by and large, people that bring up that argument, the solipsist argument, they're not solipsists themselves. So for me, all I'm doing is following Kant and saying that the only thing I can 100% guarantee is that I exist. Now, beyond that, I can't say that this table in front of me is a table, or that it's really here. I mean, but I can guess most likely that it'll be here. George Berkeley made a really good point, and he said to Descartes that because Descartes is a guy that basically invented solipsism. Of course, he thought that it was a dream instead of Matrix, or a brain in a vat. But George Berkeley said, "I kick this rock thusly." And by that, he meant I have that effect, like we were talking about intentionality. I have that effect on the world in front of me right now. And so for me, it's like, maybe the rock doesn't exist, but it's also something that I like about postmodernism. And I know that there's a lot of talk that's negative around it, but its basic premise is solid, which is basically that the analytics before that were talking about describing the world that is now. And the postmodernists said, well, that's great, but why don't we create the world around us? And that's what postmodernism really kicked off as. And so Berkeley was creating the world around it by displacing that rock. And so while we are still going to agree that we're going to call it a rock, we can't guarantee that the rock is actually there.
Yeah.
So it's still there for both of us. But
okay, but this is a very different out of topic subject, but I do want to cover it because you're going somewhere here and it has social implications. Gender, right? You're talking about construction here and for some postmodern concepts, postmodernist concepts. Do you mean like this? Could this be like a metaphysical, philosophical foundations for how the LGBT community could rationalize their sexuality and the actions that they have for how they identify themselves?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of times there's a lot of rebuttals to postmodernism, and they're not without merit. They really aren't. What I will say though is that on the fundamental level, where we're creating the world that ought to be, so to speak, we have to also come to an agreement on what ought to be, and that's kind of the main point that we have to kind of come to. When we're talking about, and personally me, I don't really have anything against the LGBTQ community myself, but I understand that there's a lot of people that don't. So we have to come to this understanding of, we have to agree what ought to be to create it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, one last question, Dave, because this has been a great, adventure for me. And, I myself, I'm actually following you and, sort of considering for myself, what if Dave is right, and this is really how reality is, I do that. And that's cool. A danger of my job here. But so Dave, so being this Norse Buddhist, and of course maybe the frontliner for the consideratism in the 21st century. So what are your plans, I guess, and the any direction that you would want to go to, moving forward?
Yeah. So as far as furthering what I want to do, what I'm working on right now is a thing called 5-minute philosophy. It's where I'm basically posting memes daily. Sometimes I make them myself, but then I'm also writing articles weekly on Medium. But then what I'm really working towards is I am trying to build out classes. I think that there's a problem in academia right now that seems to be persistent, where there's a lot of problems with it. We could go over that another time, but I see problems that I don't like in academia. And so I'm building out classes and creating my own at the same time as hopefully completing grad work and graduate work in philosophy. My goal is to actually talk about the ethics of Vlad the Impaler. And I want to see what was going on inside of his head and how he was rationalizing what he was doing. So it's interesting how we were talking about, like Hitler and him rationalizing what he was doing. I kind of want to do that with Vlad. I'm not saying that Vlad was right in what he was doing, but I want to see what sort of logical things that he could have put together to actually make what he was doing right. Yeah, because I feel like everybody's got a reason for doing what they do, and like Vlad, it just interests me because it seems like there's so little that there's a reason for him to do what he was doing, and so that's kind of where I'm going. Is I'm trying to finish grad work and get classes up and running outside of academia. That's kind of my goal.
Well, Dave, is there anything you want to promote? Like a book or a YouTube channel, other than this 5-minute philosophy that you're developing? Yeah,
sure. So other than 5-minute philosophy, right now I am I post articles and essays, primarily essays, to Medium. I'm just under David K, and that's kind of my main thing. But then just look out for when my class drops. It's going to be on Udemy, and I'm going to be advertising it after that's done. So
awesome. All right. Well, Dave, thank you so much for being in the show. It's been awesome talking to you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And hope you have a great day, man. So that's the end of it. Thanks for tuning in, guys. This is your host, Elmo Ador Jr. And thank you for listening in. And please subscribe. Please follow us on Facebook. please follow this. Please. Thanks.
University of Maryland Global Campus has more than 20 years' experience providing affordable online education to military service members and working adults, offering low tuition, no-cost digital resources replacing most textbooks, scholarships for those who qualify, and more. Learn more at umgc.edu/podcast.
If you're a movie collector, you need Movies Anywhere. It pulls your favorite purchase movies from participating digital retailers into one central place, so you can finally say goodbye to scattered movie collections and hello to an organized library. With Movies Anywhere, you can watch your favorite movies on any compatible device, whenever and wherever you want. Ready to grow and enjoy your digital collection? Visit moviesanywhere.com/welcome and register for free. Registration with Movies Anywhere required. Open to U.S. residents 13 and over.